I've got a question for you. Who gets to decide what's professional? Because over the years, I've seen people called unprofessional for tattoos, babies, honesty, swearing, challenging authority, and occasionally having far more confidence in confined spaces than good judgment would suggest. And the more I've thought about it, the more I've started to wonder whether professionalism is one of the most accepted and least questioned ideas in the workplace. Because if nobody can agree on what professionalism actually means, who gets to decide the rules? And what happens when society changes its mind? Welcome to Hard at Work with me, Trina Sunday. This space is for HR leaders who care deeply about performance and equally deeply about people. For more than 25 years, I've been asking one persistent question. What are the real conditions for happiness at work? Because when humans come first, something deeper shifts. How people show up, how leaders decide, and how work feels. Here, we explore what it really takes to lead with courage, compassion, and clarity, and we pull up a chair to the conversations HR leaders don't always get to have. There's heart here, but there's also depth. If you're ready to build workplaces where people and performance thrive side by side, you're in the right place. Let's get to the heart of it. Before we talk about professionalism, I should probably confess something. I have been fascinated by this topic for most of my life. Long before I worked in HR, long before I recruited people, managed people, led people, influenced people. Long before I found myself helping organisations define what good leadership, good culture and good behaviour actually look like. I think it probably started in school, to be honest. I grew up in Rockingham, the bogan from Rockingham, and every day I caught a bus for about 90 minutes each way to attend a girls' school in Perth's western suburbs, which meant I became very skilled very early in life at moving between different worlds. At the back of the bus, I was one version of Trina. By the time I walked through the school gates, I was another. Now, before anyone starts psychoanalyzing me, I wasn't pretending to be someone else. I wasn't leading a double life. I was still me. But even as a teenager, I understood that there were different expectations in different environments, different norms, different assumptions, different ideas about what was acceptable, what was aspirational, what was respectable, and what the right way to behave looked like. And I got pretty good at navigating those worlds. I was lucky. I didn't feel like I had to fundamentally change who I was. I was confident. I probably just had to sand off a few rough edges, I guess. And I also learned how to read the room, learned when to dial things up, when to dial things down. And other girls weren't so lucky. Some have spent years trying to become somebody else entirely. And some are still unpacking those experiences decades later. But I've often reflected on the fact that I grew up with one foot in two very different worlds. Southern suburbs roots, western suburbs education. And that combination absolutely perplexed other people in my early career. Recruiters, managers, colleagues. People were often really surprised by me, which I found fascinating. Because what exactly were they surprised by? The fact that I grew up in Rockingham and I made it out without, some unfortunate events, or the fact that I went to school in the western suburbs at all, the fact that these two things could exist in the same person. I never quite understood it. But there was often a sense that people were trying to solve a puzzle with me. They were trying to reconcile two things that didn't belong together. And eventually I realised something. People weren't evaluating me. They were evaluating their assumptions. They were trying to understand why my story didn't fit their mental model, why my background wasn't more typical, more familiar, more expected. Thankfully, university happened, then a few years living and working in the UK happened, then a few more years in other workplaces happened, and eventually nobody cared where I went to school. Nobody cared where I grew up. Nobody asked. I didn't include it on my CV either. But the lesson stayed with me because it taught me something I've never forgotten. People make assumptions extraordinarily quickly about where we come from, what we're capable of, about whether we belong, and perhaps most importantly, about whether we fit. And that's why this topic fascinates me, because the more I think about professionalism, the more I wonder whether it's one of those words we've stopped questioning, one of those words that sounds obvious until somebody asks us to actually define it. Because if I ask 10 people what professionalism means, I can guarantee I'm going to get 10 different answers. In fact, I looked it up, and even the dictionary can't agree. Depending on where you look, professionalism is defined as the competence or skill expected of a professional, the conduct, aims, or qualities that characterize a profession, or the practicing of an activity for financial reward rather than as a hobby. 3 definitions, 3 different ideas: competence, conduct, or simply getting paid to do something. Which is interesting because when most people talk about professionalism, they aren't usually talking about competence. They're talking about behaviour, appearance, communication, presentation, the unwritten rules, the social agreement, the things that signal this person belongs. And that's where things start to get interesting because social agreements change. What we consider acceptable changes. What we consider normal changes. And if professionalism is partly built on those social agreements, then maybe professionalism changes too. Which raises a fascinating question like who gets to decide? And perhaps more importantly, what happens when society changes faster than our workplaces do? So let's come back to the question. If professionalism is partly shaped by society and society keeps changing, who gets to decide when the rules change too? And the more I've thought about that question, the more I've found myself landing in a slightly uncomfortable place because I don't think professionalism is just about behaviour. I think professionalism is often about power. Like a little while ago, I was sitting in an executive meeting. Well, a little while ago could be 6 months or 6 years at my age, let's be honest. The point is, I was there. Big transformation, big personalities, big pressure. One of those meetings where everybody has a PowerPoint deck, but nobody seems to have a decision. And the executive leading the discussion leans forward and says, right, this project is f***ed if we don't make some decisions today. Nobody reacts. People nod. Somebody takes a sip of coffee. A few minutes later, we spent 6 months talking about the same issue. Still nothing, few chuckles. A little while later, look, we've made a complete up of this implementation and now we're trying to pretend like everything's fine. More nodding. People seem energized actually. Then, can we stop dancing around this? Everybody in this room knows what the fucking problem is. Again, nothing. Nobody looks shocked. Nobody reaches for the code of conduct. Nobody says, excuse me, that's not very professional. Meeting continues. The executive is viewed, I think, as authentic and direct, passionate, decisive, real. And I remember sitting there thinking something I've noticed more and more in the last few years. I hear more F-bombs in executive meetings today than at any point in my career. Not on construction sites, not in warehouses, not in hospitality, in boardrooms. Executive leadership teams, strategy sessions, white-collar environments. And before anyone starts messaging me, this is not a campaign to swear more at work. That's not the point. The point is this. Well, actually, sidebar. Who are you picturing in your mind? Picture that executive. Seriously, pause for a second. Who appeared in your mind when I described that executive? Because I suspect for many listeners, the executive you imagined was a man. And that is also interesting because if exactly the same language, exactly the same behaviour, and exactly the same energy came from a woman, would we interpret that the same way? I'm not convinced we would. Actually, I know we would not. Suddenly, she would be aggressive, emotional, intimidating, too much, unprofessional. Same behaviour, different interpretation. And before anyone sends me an angry LinkedIn message, I'm not saying everybody thinks this way. I'm saying enough people do that it still matters. Women have spent decades navigating these contradictions, right? Be confident, but not too confident. Be assertive, but not too assertive. Be strong, not too strong. Be authentic. Whoa, not too authentic. Honestly, it's exhausting when you say it out loud. In fact, while I was thinking about this episode, I suddenly find myself hearing that old Little Britain catchphrase in my head, but I'm a lady. And immediately I laugh to myself. Then immediately I think, actually, that's probably a terrible reference because Little Britain itself has become an example of changing social norms. Things that were considered hilarious 20 years ago are viewed very differently today. Characters that once appeared on primetime television now attract criticism that would have seemed unimaginable at the time. And whether you agree with that or disagree with it isn't really the point either. The point is that the social agreement changed. What society considers acceptable changed, which means what society considers funny changed. And before anyone comes at me, I'm not advocating for cancel culture. The opposite. I am not. In fact, I think one of the most powerful things we can do is revisit old content. Old television shows, old movies, old books, old leadership theories, old workplace practices. Not to celebrate them, not to condemn them, but to understand them, because that's how we learn. And one of my favourite things to do is watch something from 20 or 30 years back and ask, would that fly today? Not because I'm looking to be offended, but because I'm curious. Like, what changed? What assumptions were we making? What were we normalising? What do we now see differently? And perhaps most importantly, what are we doing today that future generations are going to look back on and ask exactly the same question about? Actually, that reminds me, before my brain disappears down a rabbit hole about world politics, societal upheaval, and the future of civilization, let's keep this grounded, because I think the most interesting examples are actually much closer to home. When I was working in London, people often smoked at their desks. At their desks, not outside, not in a designated smoking area, at their desk. Yes, that's how old I am. You could literally be typing an email or someone else's cigarette smoke drifted across your workspace. Nobody thought that was strange. That was just work. Years later, I worked with a government agency here in Western Australia where at about 4:30 every Friday afternoon, drinks would come out. Wine, beer, the occasional spirits. People would sit at their desks finishing reports with a glass of wine next to their keyboard. Again, nobody thought that was strange. That was just work. And before the younger listeners start judging me, let me remind you that one day you will be explaining TikTok to future generations. So let's all stay humble. But there were other things too. Women being expected to wear pantyhose, stockings, Men being expected to wear a tie, regardless of whether it was 40 degrees outside. The assumption that if you were sick and capable of standing upright, you came to work anyway. Managers believing working from home meant you were probably watching daytime television and getting a fix of Days of Our Lives. The office Christmas party that somehow became an all-day event and nobody expected much productivity the next morning. And then there's examples that aren't funny. My mum doesn't have superannuation. Not because she made poor financial decisions, not because she didn't work hard, but because she belonged to a generation of women who often weren't expected to have a long-term career. That was normal. Women leaving the workforce when they married, normal. Women leaving the workforce when they became pregnant, normal. The assumption was that a woman's domestic responsibilities would interfere with her work, normal. Today we hear that and we think, surely not. But yes, and not that long ago, and that's exactly the point. The assumptions that shape workplaces are rarely outrageous in the moment. They're normal until they aren't. Every generation assumes its workplace norms are sensible until they aren't. Every generation assumes its assumptions are obvious until they are not. Every generation assumes its rules are permanent until they aren't, which makes me wonder, 30 years from now, what will people say about us? Will they laugh that we spent years arguing about whether people could work from home? Will they be horrified that we expected employees to answer emails on annual leave? Will they find it bizarre that we still measure commitment through visibility? And will they wonder why we treated busyness like a badge of honour? Will they question why we insisted on interviews as the primary way of assessing capability? Because history suggests that every generation has its blind spots. Every generation has assumptions it mistakes for truth. And perhaps that's why I find the professionalism conversation so fascinating. Because I suspect some of what we call professionalism today will eventually join smoking at your desk, mandatory pantyhose, and Friday afternoon wine carts in the Museum of Workplace History. Not because professionalism is wrong, but because some of the assumptions we've attached to it won't survive the test of time. And that's where things get spicy, because the moment we start deciding what professional looks like, sounds like, or behaves like, we're not just creating standards, we're creating insiders and outsiders. We are deciding who belongs and who doesn't. And that's where this conversation starts to become less about professionalism and much more about inclusion. And at this point, some of you are probably thinking, okay, Trina, that's all very interesting, but surely some things are unprofessional. And honestly, I'm not even sure I find the word particularly useful anymore. Because when I think about the behaviours that genuinely concern me as a HR and people professional, I don't think about professionalism. I think bullying, harassment, discrimination, dishonesty, misconduct, abuse of power. Because those words tell us something. They describe behaviour. Professionalism often feels like a label we've applied after we've already made up our mind. So let's test that theory. And as we go, keep asking yourself one question. Was that actually unprofessional? Or did somebody simply decide it was? And we can start with my own career. Like years ago, I was leading HR in an organisation where 2 employees were discovered enjoying what I'll politely describe as some intimate time together during work hours. Now, before anyone gets excited, I'm deliberately preserving a little mystery here because my connections will know exactly where I'm talking about. So the exact location will remain confidential. But let's just say it involved a workplace asset. Catchy. And let's just say confined spaces training may have been unexpectedly relevant. The matter eventually reached the exec team. There was outrage, absolute outrage. People were appalled. One executive described it as completely unprofessional. Another talked about professionalism and standards. Someone else talked about professionalism and expectations. And being me, I found myself less interested in the incident and more interested in the language, because what actually concerned people wasn't professionalism. It was poor judgment. It was safety, was workplace resources, risk, was conduct, specific conduct. Professionalism was simply the label that was applied afterwards. Interesting. Now let's look at another example. The baby at the interview. A candidate's childcare arrangements falls through. Crisis. She contacts the recruiter, explains the situation, asks whether she can attend the interview with her baby. The recruiter agrees, she attends, she interviews, she gets the job. She's incredible. What exactly was unprofessional? She wasn't dishonest. She wasn't disrespectful. She wasn't incapable. Yet thousands of people online immediately labelled the behaviour unprofessional. Interesting. Then there was the recruitment CEO who stood up at a Christmas party here in Australia and essentially told employees, don't do drugs, don't sleep with your colleagues, don't create work for HR, don't make terrible decisions after 10 vodkas. But what made it controversial wasn't the advice, it was that he openly referenced his own past drug use. Some people thought that was refreshingly honest, others thought it was wildly inappropriate. Same speech, different interpretation. Interesting. Then there was the lawyer who accidentally appeared before a judge as a cat. If you haven't seen this, you have to Google it. It's the funniest thing on earth. A legal professional in court, on Zoom, as a cat, unable to remove the filter and eventually declaring, it's me, judge, I'm here live, I'm not a cat. Like millions of people watched it. And somehow it became endearing rather than career-ending. Perfection was lost, but humanity won. Interesting. Then there are tattoos. I remember when visible tattoos were considered almost automatically incompatible with professionalism. Cover them up, hide them, wear long sleeves, don't let clients see. Today, walk through government, healthcare, consulting, police, professional services. You'll find tattooed professionals everywhere. The tattoo didn't change. The social agreement did. Interesting. And that's when I realised something. Maybe this conversation isn't about professionalism at all. Maybe it's about conformity. Because the more examples I looked at, the more I found myself asking the same question. Are we evaluating conduct, or are we evaluating how closely somebody conforms to our expectations? Because they are not the same thing. Like, think about eye contact. Many interviewers still view strong eye contact as professional. Yet in some Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander cultural contexts, direct eye contact may be interpreted very differently, particularly with elders. In some cultures, avoiding eye contact can be a sign of respect, not disengagement, respect. So when somebody writes poor eye contact on an interview form, what are they measuring? Capability or conformity? And perhaps that's the question underneath this entire episode, actually. Because if professionalism at its best is about conduct, then professionalism at its worst is about conformity. And those are two very different things, which brings us to a much bigger question, right? If that's true, what should HR do about it? And where does this leave all of us? Because if you've stayed with me through babies in interviews, tattoo sleeves, executive F-bombs, cat lawyers, workplace romances, and a completely unnecessary detour into Little Britain, you might reasonably be asking, okay, Trina, what's your point? Fair question. And I think my point is actually pretty simple. I don't believe professionalism is dying. I think vagueness is dying. And I think we are becoming less willing to accept labels and more willing to ask, what do you actually mean? Because the moment somebody says that's unprofessional, my response is increasingly, okay, well, what behaviour are we actually talking about here? Be specific. Did they bully someone? Did they harass someone? Did they breach confidentiality? Did they abuse their power? Did they create an unsafe workplace? Did they fail to deliver on a commitment? Like, what is it? Or do they simply not fit our mental picture of what professional looks like? Because they are two very different things, and that matters. Because this is where I have a very strong point of view. Welcome. The future of HR can't be protecting workplace assumptions that society's already moved beyond. Like, it simply can't. Like, we cannot claim to be redefining the future of work while simultaneously defending every norm that we've inherited from the past. Like, those two positions are fundamentally incompatible. And yet I see it all the time. We talk about innovation, then reward conformity. We talk about inclusion, then reward familiarity. We talk about diversity of thought, then we recruit people who think exactly like us. We talk about authenticity, then quietly communicate which parts of people are acceptable and which parts should remain hidden. We say we want different perspectives, then we become uncomfortable when those perspectives actually arrive. And that's why I think HR has a choice. We can continue acting as custodians of the rulebook, or we can become architects of what comes next. Now, for me, that choice is obvious because every meaningful workplace shift I've witnessed in my career started when somebody challenged an assumption. Like, women belong in leadership. Work can be flexible. Mental health matters. Fathers can be primary carers. Tattoos don't determine capability. You know, people can be productive outside of the office. Every one of those ideas was controversial once. Every one of them was viewed as a threat to standards. But every one of them challenged the accepted wisdom of the day, which is why I get slightly uncomfortable when people talk about preserving professionalism. Because my next question is always, which version? The version where women left the workplace when they got married, the version where pregnant women had to resign, the version where my mum's generation retired without super, where people smoked at their desks, had bevies on Fridays, career-limiting tattoos. Which version are we preserving? Because professionalism has never stood still. Like, it's evolved constantly, just like society, just like work, just like people. And if professionalism is evolving anyway, then maybe our job actually isn't to protect it at all. Perhaps our job is to shape it, to define the behaviours that genuinely matter and to separate conduct from conformity. Like, to distinguish between standards that help people thrive and standards that simply make us comfortable. Now, by this point, some of my fellow HR people are probably becoming slightly uncomfortable. possibly clutching a policy manual, highlighting some sections of the code of conduct and wondering if I've gone too far. But every time I start talking about throwing out the rule book, my people pros, they panic. And to be clear, I'm not advocating for anarchy, but I am advocating for curiosity. I'm advocating for challenging assumptions. I'm advocating for picking up that rule book, shaking it vigorously and seeing what assumptions fall out, because there will be many. And some of those assumptions were written for workplaces that no longer exist. Some were written for societies that no longer exist. Some were written for leadership models that no longer exist. And some just have never been questioned, not because they're right, but because they're familiar. And familiarity has a remarkable ability to disguise itself as common sense. And that is one of the reasons that I created the People Unconference. It's not about giving people answers, it's to create space for questions, to bring competent, curious people into the room together and ask, what assumptions about work are we still carrying? What norms are we protecting and what rules still serve us? And which ones are simply part of same old? Because every year, somebody says something that makes the rest of us stop and think, I've never looked at it that way before. And in my experience, that's where the meaningful change starts. Not with certainty, with curiosity. Not with agreement, with challenge. And perhaps that's what this entire episode's been about. Not professionalism, not tattoos, not F-bombs, babies in interviews, cat lawyers, workplace romances, all that stuff. It's been about assumptions. The assumptions we've inherited, the assumptions we've stopped questioning, the assumptions that quietly shape our workplaces every single day. Because if we're serious about redefining the future of work, we have to become comfortable challenging things that everyone else thinks is normal. After all, every meaningful change in workplaces was once considered a terrible idea until it wasn't. And maybe professionalism isn't dying. Maybe we're finally questioning it. Because once you start questioning assumptions, you can't really unsee them. And once you can't unsee them, you have a choice. Protect the mold or redesign it. The future of HR isn't protecting the workplace of yesterday. It's helping build the workplace of tomorrow. That's hard work. And honestly, that is exactly the energy that I'm taking into the People Unconference, Punk, in Perth on 2nd of July 2026. Not a room full of people pretending to have all the answers. A room full of competent, curious people willing to challenge assumptions, explore new ideas, and have the conversations that most conferences never quite get to. The uncomfortable questions, the interesting questions, the ones that made you stop and think, I've never looked at it that way before. So if this episode resonated with you, if you found yourself nodding along, disagreeing with me, shouting at your speakers or mentally rewriting your code of conduct, I'd love to hear from you. Send us a message, learn more about the People Unconference because your energy just might want to be in that room. Until next time, keep questioning, keep challenging, and keep leading with heart. Thanks for spending time with me. If this conversation challenged you, clarified something, or simply reminded you that you're not the only one holding the tension between people and performance, then it's done exactly what it was meant to. This work isn't easy, but it is necessary. HR has a new future, and it leads with heart. So if you found value here, subscribe so you don't miss what's next. Share this episode with someone who also believes that work can be better. And if you want to go deeper, you can explore the Heart Work model, the programs, and the growing community of HR leaders at trinasunday.com. Because when HR leads with clarity, courage, and compassion, it doesn't just change workplaces, it changes lives. Until next time, keep asking better questions, keep backing your voice, and keep putting humanity at the center of performance. Let's keep heart at work.